Oh, are we live? We're live.
We're live, I think.
Diggity dog.
Calling Chris Anderson in London.
Hey, this is Chris Anderson, London.
And all the ships at sea.
Chicago.
Yes. Greetings, and how are you? See, my clock's going off, so you can tell we're on the hour here. How is it in London today?
London is a little gray, a little wet, but otherwise lovely.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It's we're having some London weather here too as well.
Are you?
But we'll wait a few moments for people to join us so we can get started. And of course, we're here every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern. It's a different time for you.
I know.
Because the time change just happened for you. You're way ahead of us.
We are, of course.
And
we're more better.
Excellent. And of course, we're on Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours Facebook and YouTube pages, and all our broadcasts are also archived on the History Happy Hour web page. So there's lots of ways.
Say that 5 times fast.
Yeah, so we got a lot of people. Who we got joining us today?
Oh, Jack, Ken, George,
Margie, Howard. Greetings, all. Patrick from Boston, Kings Park, New York, West Virginia. We have Kathy from Providence. So we got a big crew joining us today.
Yes, good.
So I think we have a sufficient number that we can get started. What do you think about that?
Then is it time for the you know what?
I think it is.
Ooh, drum roll.
And the bar is open.
Outstanding.
Excellent. And our topic today is the Yalta Conference, which remains arguably the most important meeting between the Allied Big Three leaders during World War II. In February 1945, Roosevelt and Stalin and Churchill gathered to hash out the final military moves of the war and, even more critically, confer about what post-war Europe would look like. So tensions threatened to drive those allies apart just as victory was in hand, and it was a very momentous meeting and one that remains controversial today. And our guest today, Katherine Grace Katz, has approached this topic from an unusual angle in her book, Daughters of Yalta. So she has mined some newly accessible sources to view the conference through the eyes of 3 young women who accompanied their famous fathers there: Anna Roosevelt, Sarah Churchill, and Kathy Harriman, who was the daughter of U.S. Ambassador to the Soviet Union Averell Harriman. And so the book takes a fresh look at the summit through their eyes. And Katherine Grace Katz holds degrees in history from Harvard. Oh, I went to the wrong image there. I was trying to come back out here. I don't know. Yeah, I got to get the thing going. From Harvard and Cambridge, and is a second-year student at Harvard Law School. This is her first book. Katherine, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you so much for having me.
And you're joining us from here in Chicago.
I am, yes.
Not like right around the corner, but someplace out there in Chicago.
That's a small little village somewhere in the midwestern part of the United States, is it not?
It's probably an old British fort.
You could only be so lucky, right?
Absolutely. And did everybody bring an appropriate cocktail or cocktail substitute for the day?
I do.
Stupid boys. And what you
want
to see Katherine's mug here. We want to
have
get a close
Lady
up of
Grantham, the Wit and Wisdom mug, which changes color. It reveals her wit as you pour drink inside.
Cool.
So,
wow.
It's not a cocktail, but I think equally fun for different reasons.
It's a lot more classy than.
I will, Chris. Sometime I will surprise you with a Ghost Army mug that I bought. Where
wait.
I know you have to drink every time you hear the phrase Ghost Army.
Okay.
If you. As you pour the coffee and then the logo comes on. It's not on there until it's like invisible. It's secret. It's
like the
secret.
Ghost Army.
Like the Ghost Army, right?
Wow.
All right, Katherine, that was great talking to you today. We've used up all of our time. Daughters of Yalta, a very interesting book. What brought you to this topic? How did this book come about?
I feel like this book is really the product of so many coincidences from earlier in life, which somehow came together in one project. I had always loved history ever since I was a little kid. I grew up on movies like The Sound of Music and White Christmas and The Great Escape. I used to chase my grandfather around at Thanksgiving with a notepad, asking him to tell me his stories about being in the Navy in World War II. It's kind of the self-appointed family historian as a little kid. But I also knew that I wanted to be a writer when I grew up. I loved stories like Little House on the Prairie or Anne of Green Gables. And so that's kind of the history and writing was always, those were always my biggest interests. And I think unsurprisingly, I studied history in college and somewhat coincidentally ended up spending a lot of time on Winston Churchill. I had been writing my thesis inspired by loving The Great Escape when I was little on British prisoner of war escape narratives. And I came to realize that Winston Churchill wrote the first of what we would consider the modern POW escape narrative in his account of his escape from a Boer POW camp during the Boer War, which of course rocketed him to fame and led to the origins of his political career. And so that was kind of, I knew a lot about Churchill as prime minister, but hadn't thought of him from this different perspective before. And then when I went to Cambridge to do my history master's, again, somewhat coincidentally, accidentally spent a lot of time on Churchill, this time looking at his role as Home Secretary during the First World War and the creations of what we would consider modern counterintelligence practices. So after I finished my master's, I decided I should do what I thought was the smart thing, like many other recent grads, and I moved to New York to take a job in finance. And I was a financial analyst, but much to my great fortune, there was a bookstore in the lobby of my office in Manhattan called Chartwell Booksellers, which specialized in books by and about Winston Churchill. And I think this is probably something that could only exist in New York. But fortunately for me, it was right in my lobby. So whenever I would just need a break from the Excel modeling, I'd say I was going to get a coffee. I'd go down to the store in the lobby. And I think the owner was somewhat amused that I would come in so often. And eventually he offered to introduce me to the International Churchill Society, which was having a fundraising dinner with Madeleine Albright right across the street from the office one evening. And the International Churchill Society is made up of scholars and professionals who want to encourage young people to study history and go into public service, but also members of the Churchill family. And at the dinner, I met them, and shortly thereafter, they were opening the papers of Winston's middle daughter, Sarah, to outside researchers for the first time. And so the Churchill Society asked if I was interested in writing an article about them for their magazine. This meant a trip back to Cambridge, where I had been a grad student, and a chance to re-engage with history. And of course, I said yes. But the other reason I was really interested in learning more about Sarah was because every summer since I was a little kid, my family has gone to the cloister at Sea Island, Georgia. And Sarah had gotten married there in 1949. She had eloped, had this very romantic wedding, and there was a photograph of her on the wall in the lobby that I used to walk past every day when I was there. And so it kind of felt like fate had stepped in a way, and some of my favorite things all coming into one. And so very quickly after spending just even a little bit of time reading about her life, I was fascinated, especially by her wartime experience, and knew that this would turn into something that was more than just an article.
So there it is, a lot of coincidences, and I'm so glad that your soul was saved from being a financial analyst.
I think that's where you and I, Chris, that's where we went wrong in our historian careers, is we didn't spend any time in finance.
That's because our mother says this is just a phase I'm going through. Right?
I remember shortly after that fun coincidence of meeting them at this dinner for the first time, I was walking home from the office. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon, and I had to go in that morning and saying, oh yeah, I met these people. And my mom was like, oh, you never know where this is going to go. Maybe this will lead to something interesting and a way back to history. And I was like, oh, I don't know about that. And sure enough, so there you go.
Hey.
Moms always know.
Everywhere.
Moms know everything. Always listen to your mom.
That's right. So, Katherine, one of the things that I'd be curious to know is, you're looking at the Yalta Conference, and it's safe to say that there's a lot that's been done about the Yalta Conference. What did you hope to find out about it, or were there surprises to you that given the approach that you took to the subject?
So I didn't set out to write about Yalta per se. I actually thought I was going to originally write a biography of Sarah Churchill. She had a really interesting life. If people today know her, it's usually because she was an actress and a dancer, and she starred in a movie opposite Fred Astaire in 1951 called Royal Wedding. But the more I learned about her, it was really her wartime years that most intrigued me, especially her opportunities. Well, first, she was a an officer in the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the women's branch of the Royal Air Force. And she would look at aerial reconnaissance images that had been taken by recon pilots and make intelligence assessments based on this. And she knew the details of Allied operations, especially in the Mediterranean, incredibly well, sometimes even better than her father. And he would like to brag about this and sometimes leaked some details that were top secret. And Sarah get called in front of her superiors, and they'd say, "Who told the press about this?" She'd say, "My dad was bragging about me. I'm sorry." And so I thought I was going to write about Sarah, and then specifically her experiences as her father's aide at the Tehran and Yalta conferences. But the more I learned about that, the more fascinated I became by the fact that not only had Sarah been at Yalta, but also Anna Roosevelt and Kathy Harriman. And the daughters, Kathleen was 27, Sarah was 30, and Anna was 38. And I was about 26 when I started looking at this, and I just was fascinated by this idea of what would it be like to be about my age and to be at one of the greatest summits in history, where you're there interacting regularly, not only with Churchill and FDR, but also Stalin and Vyacheslav Molotov and all these incredible figures from history. And so, it kind of was that seed of an idea that kept niggling at me. And I knew I didn't want to stay in finance forever, but I thought I would go to law school. And then I was like, well, maybe I should look into this. And so it was really just kind of this one thing led to another. And before I knew it, I just I love this. I want to know everything about it.
Right.
But for me, the thing that was so revealing in looking at the Yalta Conference through their eyes was just how personal an experience it was. I think it's easy to think of summits and the great men of history, kind of in all capital letters up on this pedestal. But really, at the end of the day, they are also somebody's dad. And what would it be like to be that person who thought of them as dad? And then also just the interpersonal relationships that were so crucial to the conference. Of course, the relations between nations, but also the relations between the leaders themselves and the very personal ties through which they were all very closely intertwined.
No, you can.
Well, I mean, one of the things I'd be curious to get your opinion on is I was having a conversation with some of the folks over at King's College, and we were talking about World War II history and World War II historiography, and a bunch of the younger academics were kind of moaning and groaning that, oh my God, everything's already been written about this. What am I going to say? What's been said before? And interestingly, some of the older academics, I'm thinking of Stephen Weiss.
Like people our age.
Yeah, even older. I was just an observer.
Impossible.
But he said, no, this is actually the best time to be looking at the Second World War, because our generation, the older generation, it was more current events. And what Catherine's done with her book, and I'm thinking of Dr. Fennell and some others, they're looking at the history new and maybe bringing some fresh perspectives to it. And this might be too big a topic, but I was just wondering, is there something to be gained now by detached people looking at these events? And what do you think maybe we can find out new, or how we can look at some of these events new? Because, as we already mentioned, Yalta's already been talked about, but you're looking at it in a really new way.
Yes.
So can we look forward to bigger things, or,
Well, I think part of it is the availability of new sources. It's maybe surprising to think that 75 years after the fact, there could still be new information coming to light. And in this case, the papers of Sarah Churchill had not been open to outside researchers previously. Similarly, Kathleen Harriman's papers had not been seen in any kind of comprehensive way. A handful of her letters had made their way into her father's collection in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., but she only passed away in 2011, and she really didn't talk about the war or her experience in London and Moscow as at her father's side. Because like many members of the greatest generation, she didn't think what she did was particularly important. She thought she was just doing her bit. And so she was very humble about this experience. And after she passed away in 2011, her sons discovered a box of her letters to her sister and others in a closet in her apartment. And so it's this treasure trove that was just literally sitting in her closet for decades. And very fortunately, I was able to connect with the family, and they so generously allowed me to see all of her papers and scrapbooks and appointment books from this time. And so part of it is a new availability of sources. But I also think that sometimes it requires certain events or this kind of signals that we get from living in our own time that make us think about the past in a different way. And even these really well-trodden paths of history, sometimes there are stories that lay kind of just outside of it, just out of view. and something in our own time will make us re-examine the past in a different light, not applying the lens of kind of current values or perspectives to history, but just it makes you notice things that you wouldn't have otherwise. And so I think, the combination of news sources that are still being opened, and then also technology, making it easier to get to archival collections that previously were inaccessible to people for financial reasons or geographically. And so for all of those reasons, it is easier on the one hand to do research, but also perhaps a little more daunting because you do have kind of the world at your disposal, and how do you divide your resources and your time to see everything, but it does give you more options and also just this different lens of consideration.
I want to just follow up on that, and we'll get back to the actual topic and the women and learn more about them. But is it also important who's doing the writing? Because in this case, you're a young woman, you're writing about young women. Maybe that's a detail that if old guys like you were writing about it might miss. And is there kind of a value, or I think there is, how much value to not only a new generation of historians, but historians from all different kind of coming at it from all different directions, not just gender, but in other ways as well.
Yes, I mean, different perspectives and diversity in approach always leads to better outcomes and new ways of looking at things, and things that, for whatever one's own biases is, that you will miss things or discount them, or they won't even occur to you to ask those questions just because of your own experience. I think, yes, of course, opening the field and encouraging people of all backgrounds to go into it is very important, and something that I think is happening, and it's really exciting to see that. I don't know that a man couldn't write this story, or even a woman who was a couple decades older than me couldn't have written the story. I think that perhaps it's kind of this confluence of having access to these papers, but also my interest in it, because thinking what would it be like to be this age and to be there. That was something that was really intriguing to me. The daughters have sporadically popped up here and there in other scholarship, but a lot of the previous scholarship on Yalta has been very focused on the geopolitics and the happenings in the conference room and the plenary sessions among the big three specifically. And that history on its own is just so packed with information that you're already writing a 500-page book, and then to also include kind of the biography of the daughters and their activity, it just takes it in a completely different direction that you may not have space to do if that's what your focus is. And so I didn't want to write a new geopolitical history of Yalta, and you can't tell the story of Yalta without that. But I do think that there is a much more personal story here, and I don't know if it's because of who I am and how old I was, or maybe the fact that I had studied both in the US and the UK, that I kind of saw it from that frame as well. So I don't know what it is specifically that makes one thing stand out to one person but not another. But I certainly think it helped that I was able to think about being in their position. But that's not to say that it's impossible to do if you don't have that shared experience, because that's what imagination and research are for.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll just bring in a question from one of our audience members that touches on this as well. Did the fact that women in these positions have often been ignored historically have a part in your decision to write about these three?
I think that it wasn't so much that I began this kind of on a mission to amend the historical record. It was more that I just found these women so personally fascinating, and their story of their relationships with their fathers, which, if their fathers are choosing to bring them to Yalta, says to me that there's something really important about this relationship that we have somehow missed, and it's one that we should better understand. And so it was more of this really personal side of what can seem to be a very impersonal and distant kind of realpolitik moment in history. And so it was more the wanting to understand the personal side of it. And also something, this is a moment in history that I think can feel very intimidating to people, and certainly does, for students when they're young, learning about this for the first time. And more than wanting to write a story kind of revealing women specifically in history, and I'm really glad that the result of this is that I have done that in a sense, but also showing people that there are many different approaches to understanding a moment in history, even some that seem very kind of, political, jargony, there are different ways of understanding it, and the relationship between parent and child is something that we can all understand from our own experience. And through that lens, we can also understand these really important moments kind of on the precipice between World War and Cold War.
So Katherine, since you were talking about your background in Churchill, we use him as an example. But are there things that you learned about Churchill, and the same would apply to Harriman and Roosevelt, by looking at them through the eyes of their children that you may not have seen before?
Well, I think that you don't think of these men necessarily as being feminists or especially progressive in their outlook. And of any of them, you probably think Franklin Roosevelt is the most progressive in his outlook. Mm-hmm. But surprisingly, in his relationship with his female family members, I'd say he was actually the least progressive in many ways. And Churchill was more, he had more value on the relationship with his daughters and his wife and their contributions to his professional life. And that was really surprising to me. And also, he's not as involved a parent as we would think of someone being involved today. I mean, she's growing up, she's born in 1914. In the British upper class, you still have nannies and governesses. And so it's not like the day-to-day interaction of raising your child, but he was a much warmer and more involved father than I had expected him to be. Mm-hmm. And Averell Harriman is also someone who I was really surprised at how ahead of his time he was in his relationship with his daughters. He really wanted to involve them in his business to the extent that they wanted to be involved. It was very encouraging of them professionally and academically. And it was his urging that led Kathleen to come with him in London early in the war, first as a war reporter during the Blitz. And to think, as a parent, you probably don't want to put your child in danger, but then to also realize that this would be a remarkable professional opportunity and just life experience for his daughter to have at 23, 24 years old, rather than pushing her to go, a more traditional path for a woman of her class and era. And so it is surprising, you think of people in a certain way, but it's when you understand the relationships with those who were closest to and most important to them that you begin to see a much more nuanced character, which I think gives a more complete picture of the person that they were, and one that is sometimes really refreshingly surprising.
Yeah, I love that moment when you described Anna leaving notes on her dad's pillow before she... Now, before you go and meet Joe, don't forget to ask him.
And don't eat the caviar.
Yeah, that's
right. So, where am I trying to go with this? I wanted to just mention that Averell Harriman he's a name that, everybody knows who Churchill is, everybody knows who Roosevelt is, probably most of our audience knows who Averell Harriman is, but can you give us the 30 seconds on Averell Harriman and his daughter so people kind of realize who this character is?
Yes. So Averell Harriman, I'd say, is one of the most important, but today kind of one of the least recognized members of the kind of this upper echelon of thinkers and leaders from the mid-20th century. If people know him today, they often know him as a wise man of the Cold War. He would go on to become the governor of New York and later a Democratic presidential candidate. But before that, early in his career, like his father before him, he was the chairman of Union Pacific Railroad. He was the founder of Brown Brothers Harriman, the banking firm, Newsweek magazine, Sun Valley, the ski resort, which was the first glamorous Western American ski resort that we had. After the Lake Placid Olympics in 1932, Americans caught the ski craze, and he realized he had a great business opportunity to encourage people to use the railroad lines out west by giving them a destination for skiing like those in the Alps. And so he created Sun Valley, and also thanks to his engineers at Union Pacific, we now also have a chairlift. So it's kind of a fun aside of things that he's involved in that people may not even realize. And he, like his father before him, was very keen on not only excelling in business, but also looking after the people who work for them and giving back to public service. And so he started his life as a Republican, but then later joined FDR's New Deal administration, partly through the urging of his sister, Mary Harriman Rumsey, who, like Frances Perkins, was one of the top women in the New Deal. And so he is a really fascinating person who had so many different endeavors, but also really believed in public service as a calling, and largely left his business career behind him after that. And he did first serve as FDR's Lend-Lease envoy before the U.S. entered the war in London, where he became very good friends with Winston Churchill. And then he became FDR's ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1943.
Yeah, I will do shameless.
Oh, you're gonna name drop again? Oh,
Shameless.
Here we go.
Shameless. I met Averell Harriman. So
Did you?
I did.
That's how old he is.
That's how old I am. At the
well, Averell Harriman lived a long time, so
the 1976 Democratic Convention, which we were talking about last week as well. So we're gonna have to start drinking every time we talk about that convention, also, Chris. But that's sort of just a cool tie to history. He was striking even as a much older man. Of course, when he was younger, he was like movie star handsome.
Yes.
And
very glamorous.
Which leads me to. The relationship between Britain and America is sometimes called the special relationship, but there's a lot of other special relationships going on in your story that are romantic relationships that kind of intertwine a bunch of the characters and, for that matter, the governments of the two countries.
Yes.
And I think that's a pretty fascinating public-private thing going on there. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. I think that the story just goes to show that politics is always personal. So one of the most famous affairs kind of from the Second World War is Averell Harriman's affair with Pamela Churchill, who was Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law. Pamela was married to Randolph Churchill. And when Kathleen Harriman came to London in 1941 with her father, she and Pamela Churchill quickly became best friends. Pamela was 2 years younger than Kathleen, who was 23 at the time. And Pamela was an interesting character. She had this desire to be important and in the mix, but really wanted to do so kind of in the model of a courtesan, kind of a time gone by, and derived a lot of power from this. And so Averell Harriman and Pamela Churchill had this affair, and Kathleen, Averell Harriman's daughter, found out about it, and she agreed to cover up for the affair kind of between her father and her best friend, so that she wouldn't be sent home if the situation in London became more dangerous with the Blitz. Her father at the time was married to her stepmother, Marie Norton Whitney, so she didn't feel a huge amount of loyalty to her stepmother. So she kind of made herself indispensable in a way by protecting this relationship. They would go on to break it off after he went to Moscow, but Kathleen continued to write to Pamela. And then years later, Averell Harriman and Pamela, after they were a widow and widower, they reconnected at a dinner in Washington, D.C., where they fell in love again and got married, even though he was almost 80 and she was 50. So this is one of these kind of affairs that goes on for a long time. But Pamela was also having affairs with many other important people. She was having an affair with Edward R. Murrow, the famous reporter, but also two other people who were at the Yalta Conference, Peter Portal and Fred Anderson. So you have a lot of letters from Yalta, people showing off to Pamela how much they know. And so thanks to those affairs, we have a lot of great information. Was it a good thing? Probably not. But then also Sarah Churchill, who she has a kind of an estranged relationship with her husband at this time. He was an actor. They met in a production before the war. He was an Austrian citizen at the time. And Churchill didn't really approve of this relationship, and the marriage did break down. And they would have divorced, except they didn't want to cause a scandal for Winston Churchill in the middle of the war, so they agreed to wait. And in the meantime, Sarah fell in love with the American ambassador to Britain, John Gilbert Wynant, who is not at Yalta, but he is consistently writing to the representatives at the conference from his position in London. And then there's a very brief fling between Kathleen Harriman and FDR Jr. And so you have a lot of these different layered relationships, and it's all very intertwined and feels somewhat soap opera-ish at times. But because of the flurry of letters from these affairs, we have so many fantastic details to mine as historians.
Can we make a TV series, Yalta Abbey, out of this?
You're talking to Julian later. Rick could, he'd be happy to help out with that. No, but one of the, I guess, beyond that aside, one of the things that amazes me, and it gets to the special relationship question, is just how intimate these families and these people become.
Yes.
I'm going to quote from the book. It says, "The longer they lived in England, the more the Harrimans felt adrift between these two shores of the Atlantic." And as an American living in England and having lived here for quite a while, I can kind of feel that pull back and forth. And so you have the Hopkins, and the Harrimans, and it's like one family, the British and the Americans together. Roosevelt certainly wants to keep, Churchill certainly wants to keep that going. But by the time of the conference, I kind of have the sense that Roosevelt says, yep, that was great, thanks, moving on now. And I was wondering if you saw that relationship breaking down. So if it does, is it a special relationship, or is it just at least in Roosevelt's eyes, an expediency thing?
Yeah, so the special relationship, that's a phrase coined by Winston Churchill after the war in his speech in Fulton, Missouri, where he also talks about the Iron Curtain. But the groundwork for that was really the personal relationship and the great friendship between FDR and Winston Churchill, even before the United States entered the war. And it's one that really is kind of based on the ties between the two of them personally, and their families become very close friends, and their envoys like Harry Hopkins, who was a longtime special advisor to FDR, who spends a lot of time in Britain kind of because he's kind of like the eyes and almost like the legs for FDR to get over there early in the war. And so there are so many reasons for them to be allies, and the shared history and language. And Churchill talks a lot about the history of the English-speaking people. So it is a natural relationship, of course. But by the time 1945 rolls around, the balance of the tripartite allied relationship has really shifted. The British Empire is significantly weaker than they were early in the war. I remember a professor of mine saying that Britain had mortgaged the empire to pay for and continue to fight the war before the Americans entered. And the Soviet Union is significantly stronger. They have boots on the ground across Eastern Europe. They're firmly in control of Poland and really across Eastern Europe. And the race is on now to see who will be the first to liberate Berlin. And so Churchill is still someone that FDR really admires and enjoys, but he can also see the rising importance of the Soviet Union in the post-war world. And he really wants to bring Stalin into the kind of the community of nations after the war through things like the United Nations organization, which is one of the key issues to resolve at Yalta. And so he wants to form this special relationship with Stalin and do so in a very personal way. He really believes in the powers of personal persuasion and doesn't have a lot of faith in his State Department to build this relationship, but thinks that, if he can make Stalin like him personally, he will have a breakthrough in international relations that will preserve this relationship in the post-war world. Unfortunately, things don't work out as well as FDR had hoped. And you can see kind of some of the later figures who would be very instrumental in the Cold War, like Chip Bolin and George Kennan, who are chiming in the background about the way FDR is pursuing foreign policy. And so it is kind of, as much as he does like Winston Churchill, he has these other objectives, like bringing the Soviet Union into the war in the Pacific and, securing the United Nations cooperation, that makes the relationship with Stalin more of a priority.
Mm-hmm.
I want to remind everybody that we're talking to Katherine Grace Katz, who is the author of the book Daughters of Yalta. And please let us know if you have a question. Please post it up for us. I'm going to take a question here from Howard, who asks, did these three women enjoy each other's company and take advantage of their relationship with each other to escape the cigars?
Yes, they did enjoy each other's company. It's easy to think of them kind of as, a natural united block in a sense, kind of these three women. They're the only three women. They kind of act united as a team. That's not exactly the case. They did largely enjoy each other, and Kathleen and Sarah were already friends from their family's friendship in London, but neither of them had ever met Anna Roosevelt before. And so Anna comes in as, even though she's the oldest of the three daughters and the daughter of the president, she is the least experienced in foreign policy. And Kathleen Harriman also has the benefit of having lived in London and the United States, obviously, and then also the Soviet Union since 1943. So everybody across the three delegations knows who she is. And they kind of defer to her as the ranking daughter in a sense, just because they're familiar with her. And Anna is a bit miffed about this early on. See a lack of confidence that Anna has about her own self and her position there. Kathleen's completely oblivious to the fact that Anna doesn't like her all that much. But they do get along well enough, and they have these opportunities to go out and see the local community in the Crimea and the lives of the regular people there, whose futures will be changed by what's happening in their father's discussions in the conference room. And so they have these really unique shared experiences that do kind of bind them for the rest of their lives, though they don't leave Yalta being these great friends who kind of keep in touch regularly throughout their lives, though their lives do intersect later. And so they did certainly enjoy each other, but you can also see a number of other people from the conference that they brought into their little circle as kind of the friends and family of the great leaders, like Peter Portal, who was the head of the RAF, who was a very good friend of the daughters. Harry Hopkins has brought his son to be the official photographer for the Americans. He's a photographer for the U.S. Army Signal Corps. And so you have a couple of other really colorful figures who are brought into the fold, and you have this group of really bright personalities that are all together with the daughters at the core.
So Katherine, along those lines, since we're talking about all these personal stories, are there any stories or personal stories that you wanted to put into the book that you couldn't or didn't find space for, or little tidbits?
Yes, I mean, there's.
I don't want to put that spot.
Well, if you look at the notes in the back of the book, there are about 100 pages of notes because there are many tidbits that I would have loved to have fit into the main body of the story. One that I would have loved to have explored more is the story of Alger Hiss, who was, of course, a spy. Would go on to become notorious after the war and in the beginning of the Cold War. He is, at the time, one of the very few State Department representatives there in the American delegation, because FDR doesn't really like the State Department. He doesn't really trust them. He thinks that he and Harry Hopkins refer to them as nannies and cookie pushers, that they kind of just gum up the works and don't really achieve much of anything. But also people like James Clement Dunn, who was someone who was an expert in Eastern Europe, but had a much more skeptical view of the Soviets than FDR did. And so he elects to leave senior people like that at home and instead bring a rising star like Alger Hiss to the conference. Unfortunately, the State Department and the White House had been warned about Hiss a couple of years earlier by the person who was his handler in the 1930s, and then had a change of heart and kind of ratted out the Soviets against the Americans, which is Whittaker Chambers, who's gone to become famous for the Pumpkin Papers. And so it's these kinds of things that are also going on in the background of Yalta. We don't know exactly what Alger Hiss was doing at Yalta, what specific information he was passing along, but he does become someone who the Soviets recognize as being more important because he has chosen to come along. And so it's kind of, that's one of the stories that I would have loved to have spent more time on in the course of the narrative.
Of course, one of the political questions at Yalta, we talked about it. We haven't dealt a lot in our conversation, although you do in the book with the substance of the conference. They are meeting to talk about the how they're going to wrap up the war, but they're also talking about the post-war, and in particular about Poland. And this is, I think, probably the area where Yalta becomes most controversial or most regarded as a failed summit, because they don't really, they can't pin Stalin down to get him to agree to free elections, to get him to agree to the Polish government in exile in London being part of the new government of Poland. A lot of criticism over this. So, kind of a two-part question. Do you think that the British and Americans kind of got what they could in this situation? I mean, because Stalin had an army already in Poland. He probably wasn't going to leave just with a gentle tap on the shoulder. And did any of the women involved? There's a lot of negative blowback about that over the decades afterwards. Did any of that affect the women involved who were at the conference?
Yeah, so you can see the deep anxiety that Winston Churchill particularly has about Poland through the eyes of Sarah. Sarah's role there is really as kind of I see her as the conscience of the conference in a way, that she can reflect her father's great anxieties. And yes, of course, he says things in 1944 like, if only I could have dinner with Stalin once a week, we would have no trouble. And so there's this kind of split personality element with Stalin and the Soviet Union, where Churchill feels like he and Stalin get along really well personally, but kind of the figures around Stalin are not to be trusted. And so therefore, even if Stalin likes you, you can't really rely on his word. And even though he goes home and signals that, yes, this has been a great triumph, this is a huge success, he doesn't really feel that way personally. And you can see that when he's having these private conversations with Sarah. There's a lovely moment where they're standing on the rail of their ship at the end of the conference and looking out of the destroyed city of Sevastopol. And Sarah asks him if he's tired, and he says, no, but I do feel the weight of responsibility more than ever. And in my heart, there's deep anxiety. And so you can see a much more honest reflection through Sarah of kind of how Winston Churchill perceives the outcome of the conference to be. It's kind of one of these difficult things where you can fall down a counterfactual spiral where, what if they had a more united front against Stalin before going into the negotiations? What if Franklin Roosevelt wasn't so sick at Yalta? Would he have been able to negotiate more forcefully? But the reality is, as you mentioned, the Red Army was firmly in control in Poland, and that for that to have been different, big changes would have had to have been made in 1942, 43, opening the Western Front much earlier. Even, rearmament in Britain and the United States would have had to be begun much earlier, so that you didn't have that as the condition on the ground by the time you get to Yalta. And so I do think it's a slightly counterproductive in a way to kind of think of if that, maybe we wouldn't have had this situation without these other changes that would have had to create a systemic change in the war. But you can really see the pressure that is on the daughters, because as the reader now that Poland was not a success. And you can see again through Sarah's eyes is, all this pressure that Churchill feels and the frustration and the emotion that she's really trying to help him channel his best arguments before he goes into the meetings in these late night conversations she's having with him, kind of in his, closeted Privy Council with her and the foreign minister, Anthony Eden, and his doctor, Lord Moran, kind of this small trusted core. But then with Anna, you can also see how desperate she is to literally keep her father alive at this conference. She's doing everything she can, and sometimes it's running interference and preventing meetings between FDR and Churchill, with FDR's kind of allowing her to do to further his objectives with building this bond with Stalin, but kind of allows her to do it for the sake of, let's not wear him out. We don't want Stalin to think that, Churchill and FDR are ganging up on him. And so you can see the daughters being used on the one hand in a very productive way in the case of Winston Churchill, but then also in a somewhat counterproductive way in the way FDR uses Anna quite unfairly as a sort of pawn sometimes in his larger strategy.
Chris, we have a bunch of questions from
people. Yeah, I was
going
to say, why don't you...
Do you want to pick one, or you want me to do it?
Well, no, I mean, actually, why don't you ask the question about Stalin, the Tom's question there?
Sure. So,
and I want to add to that. So read that out, and then I'll add to it.
I'll read this, and then you can add
I know you like to read them. I know you like to.
Do we know anything about the opinion these women had of Stalin, or anything about the impression he made upon them? Chris, would you like to add anything to that?
I would, Rick. No, actually, I was just going to ask, in the course of your research, obviously, it's focused on the daughters of these leaders. They're the Western leaders. But did you find out anything about the Soviets that surprised you, or...
Mm-hmm. So yes, the women did have an opinion about Stalin, and they did interact with him at the conference, most notably at a grand banquet that he holds towards the end of the conference, where he has all three delegations come to the villa in which he's staying at Yalta, which had been the former home of the mastermind behind the plot to assassinate Rasputin. So you have these atmospherics kind of overlaying this dinner, which is very palpable tension, and I can't imagine he wasn't trying to send some sort of message with his voice at this villa. And so you do have the daughters interacting with Stalin there, also with Vyacheslav Molotov and Lavrentiy Beria, who is the head of the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, the predecessor of the KGB. And he is a fearsome figure who Stalin kind of brags to FDR about as being our Himmler, which is very creepy and awful, and not something that we would joke about. And you also have these very menacing interactions between Beria and Sarah and Anna, which are very uncomfortable. And so you have the daughters again kind of reflecting this split image of Stalin that particularly Churchill has. On the one hand, he's a very generous and gracious host. He really wants to show off the best of the Soviet Union through just the most glamorous food that they can provide that shows off, Russian cuisine, Georgian cuisine. It's just over the top for anything that anyone would expect in a place that's been just completely destroyed by the war. And so you have these really odd juxtapositions of just the primitiveness of this, but then also just the splendor, which is, again...
Oh, we have a freeze. And you're frozen for a moment, Katherine, but you're back.
Great. Yes. So Sarah at one time talks about Stalin being this very genial host, but you can see as you look into his eyes, he has the eyes of cold water. And Kathy also kind of reflecting what her father's saying about Stalin, Averell has remarked to her about how he likes to doodle during meetings. And if things are going well, he'll have just these kind of friendly, happy doodles on the side of his page. Then as soon as things start to go in a negative direction, his doodling becomes very menacing, and he starts to doodle things like wolves. And so it's kind of these small details that you can see that the daughters do have a read on Stalin that is very similar to their father's.
So we had. I'm going to combine because we're running towards. We're not at the end, but we're getting close. But we have another question about Stalin and his daughter. So I'll do these two questions together. Margie wants to know, did Stalin bring his daughter? Did he know that the other daughters were attending before he arrived there? But there's another question that you might want to deal with at the same time, which is why did these men bring their daughters versus their sons? So certainly in the case of Roosevelt and Churchill, they had adult sons who were involved in various parts of the war effort and could have done that. So a two-part question there, 2 for 1.
Yeah. So yes, Stalin did have a daughter. Her name is Svetlana, and at the time she's 19 years old. She does speak English, so she could have been a very useful asset to Stalin, but they have a pretty bad relationship. He doesn't like her to interact with foreigners. Winston Churchill did meet her one time when he goes to Moscow for a conference with Stalin, but Stalin kind of trots her out like a prop almost to say, see, I'm this family man, which is odd. And
Uncle Joe.
Yeah, exactly, Uncle Joe. It's whenever people today call like Joe Biden Uncle Joe, which is I get it. I'm like, no, like that was Stalin. Please, let's use something else.
Yeah, different reference.
So he does not bring Svetlana. She's 19 years old and married and pregnant with her first child, and she had a lover before who was much older and Jewish, and Stalin sent him to Siberia, and then she makes a rebellious marriage, marries one of her classmates who is also Jewish, and Stalin refuses to meet the man, does not meet his son-in-law. And so she is not there. He was aware that the others would be bringing their daughters. He had met Sarah at the Tehran conference, and Kathleen Harriman had been, she was the woman that had more access to Stalin in his inner circle than any other American woman in history. So she was just kind of a fixture of Averell Harriman's world. Wherever he went, she went. So the reason that they brought their daughters, it's a little different for each of them. The Churchills, as a family early in the war, decided that whenever Winston traveled abroad, someone from the family should go with him. Clementine occasionally does go. Clementine's his wife, but she hates flying, and so she tries to avoid those trips where there will be flying. Mary Churchill goes with her mother also when they go to meet Roosevelt in the United States and Canada earlier in the war, and then she does go to Potsdam. But Sarah is chosen because she has both the temperament and training kind of as an actress to be very effective in diplomatic situations, but also the technical knowledge she has because she has been in the women's branch of the RAF. And she also really has this astute grasp of her father's mind. She's always felt since she was a little girl that she understands him better than anyone except her mother. And she really does. She kind of says she's able to walk in silent step with him, to really channel him in the most productive way when he is feeling frustrated or emotional about what's going on. And so it's kind of this combination of her temperament and her technical skill and experience that makes her the perfect person compared to her brother, Randolph, who is in the military, but he's a bit more of a loose cannon. He's not very diplomatic. He drinks too much.
At a china shop.
Yeah, so he's not the best choice in this kind of situation, although he does put in a brief appearance in Malta, where Churchill and FDR meet on their way to Yalta. Kathleen had been with her father throughout the whole war, and she speaks Russian, so she's able to be a liaison between the Soviets and the Americans for the logistics of the conference, acting almost like what we would think of as a protocol officer at the State Department today. And so she has very useful skills for the actual operations of the conference. And her father really relies on her as an extension of himself, kind of as the ambassador. And then Anna, it's a break from any other experience she had with her father before, because she had always begged to come along on an international conference like this, but FDR had always chosen to bring one of his sons, usually to help him physically, to help him stand and to move around. And even though he doesn't know what's wrong with him health-wise at this point, he's dying of congestive heart failure, and only Anna and the doctor know this. Even Eleanor can't bring herself to see how sick he is. And FDR himself doesn't ask his doctor any questions about his health. But he clearly knows something's wrong. And so this is why he turns to Anna, kind of knowing that for the last year that she's been living in the White House while her husband is in the army, that she's been protecting him somehow and acting as his gatekeeper. And so he says to Winston Churchill in January, if you're thinking of bringing Sarah to this conference again, I am considering bringing Anna as well. And so he doesn't say why he has this change of heart, but it's very clear that he knows something is wrong and that Anna is protecting him from it.
So can I go again, Rick, or are you going to?
I'm waiting. I'm waiting with bated breath to hear the.
I know you are.
The brilliant,
okay. Yeah.
question
Well,
line of questioning.
It won't be
that's
brilliant,
about to
I
come.
promise. So one is a not to put you on the spot question, but it is a question.
Oh, that will put you on the spot.
That will go. But I've noticed in the cover of the book has got the three daughters there. Yep, we go.
Right, we got.
But then in the picture that it's taken from, Anna is in the center. So I just didn't know if it's like because Kathleen is more central to the story, or that's just an art department going mad.
We want to know if there's a plot here.
Yeah,
we want to
sure.
know what is going on with the manipulation of images here. We think there's a big story here.
I don't know. I was just curious.
It's actually kind of a funny story. It is purely just art driven. So once
Thank
you
you.
colorize the photo, the way that Anna's holding her arms and she's holding her purse and her gloves, it kind of looked like she was holding a cat once you put color into it.
You got a point there. Yeah, she does.
So to just kind of, because of that, it's one of those funny things when you start manipulating photos that were originally black and white. Of course, the original image is in color, but the way it looks in a photograph is very, very different then. And so it just looked kind of funny. So we flipped the positions of them. And also, I think it kind of makes sense because I kind of see the three women on a gradient, kind of the Churchills on one side, the Roosevelts on the other side, and the Harrimans kind of as the intermediaries between them. And so I think it makes sense, even though it is flipping their position from what is in the original picture. I think it makes sense both artistically, so it doesn't look like she's holding a cat, and also kind of in the spirit of the story.
And how long?
So it was not a plot, Rick. See?
How long have you had this aversion to cats? Okay.
Well, I see the great joke is that my name has
cats?
cat in it twice, and I'm horrifically allergic to cats. So do with that.
See, that's the insight.
Okay. Wow.
But the serious question I was going to ask Rick.
You can keep going, babe.
Oh no, but
you're on a
this
roll
book,
now. I mean, you're uncovering stuff nobody else has uncovered.
That's right.
You dig in.
The book talks about how this is such a special moment for the daughters and their relationships with their fathers, and certainly I would say for Anna, this is like a high point.
Yes.
But after the war, their lives are kind of difficult for the daughters. And I would just kind of like to get your thoughts on kind of the children of these leaders and how that may have affected them, and was this the high point of their life, and just kind of your thoughts on that after.
Yeah. So I think, like for so many women, the war opened opportunities for these daughters and many other women of their era to use skills and to be valued in ways that they hadn't had a chance to do before the war. But they also were very aware that this was a limited window of opportunity. And as soon as the war ended, the world would shift again and they would be on the outside looking in many instances. And for each of these daughters, they had always desperately wanted to be someone who was invaluable to their fathers, especially in difficult times. They wanted to be that person that they could rely on, who could be a partner at their side, supporting them, and also helping and using their own abilities, kind of the natural gifts they had. These men obviously were great leaders, extremely talented, and that has their daughter shares those genes. And so it's this very personal experience, kind of a capping off a personal dream that they each had since they were little girls. But I think that they also had made peace with the fact that this was only a limited window of opportunity. And it was one chapter in their lives, I wouldn't say that this was for each of them, the high point of their lives. It certainly was very exciting for them, and they were well aware that they were living through a significant moment in history. And you can see this in their letters and their diaries, that they are articulating this while they're living through it. For each of them, their lives would be different after the war. Sarah returned to her career as an actress, and like I said, she started in a movie with Fred Astaire after the war, so that was thrilling. It was a huge accomplishment professionally for her. Kathleen Harriman briefly returned to her work as a reporter for Newsweek, but she did then marry and have children. And she loved her children more than anything. She was a great athlete. She was an Olympic level skier, an expert equestrian, and her children shared these loves with her. And so, just hearing from her sons about the incredibly warm memories that they have of their mother, I think that she felt that her role as a mother was equally important to her as her role as a journalist and her father's assistant ambassador. And for Anna, there were more ups and downs as well. I think after her father died, just 8 weeks after Yalta, it really turned her world upside down, because practically her whole adult life, her father had been president. And after he dies, their home is no longer the White House. He's left their home in Hyde Park to the government to become the FDR Library Museum. And so it really is just it's a very unmooring experience for her to have this world that's been dominated by her father's presidency just suddenly to be gone overnight. And each of the women, they do experience similar tragic elements in their lives, like so many people whose lives were scarred by the wars, and sometimes in ways that you can't even see for decades after. We have such a better understanding of mental health now, and you can see the struggles that their loved ones, especially their husbands, had after the war, decades later even. And sometimes this kind of gave them an opportunity to come back together in a sense. There's a lovely moment where Anna is writing to Sarah years later about this shared experience with tragedy in the aftermath of war, and kind of being in the public eye and being very scrutinized because of who they are. And so while they don't leave Yalta the best of friends, they do have these elements that tie them together for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
Well, Katherine, the hour has gone by very fast, and we so appreciate your joining us today to talk about this and this very interesting take. We could do a second hour, but sadly, that's not in the cards. But I want to remind everybody that Katherine's book is The Daughters of Yalta, the Churchills, Roosevelts, and Harrimans, A Story of Love and War. Lots of interesting stuff in there, including just all the visual descriptions of kind of what it's like to be at this conference, what the buildings are like, the luxurious and yet primitive accommodations. So very, very interesting. Katherine Grace Katz, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Katherine.
Thank you so much for having me.
Good luck. Don't forget to mention Rick to Julian when you talk, though.
I will.
Yalta Abbey.
Yalta.
Okay. So if they'd had, I mean, they only went to places that rhymed with Alta on that trip. Malta and Yalta. Yes, so if there was a place called Balta, I don't know where we're going to go with that.
Bad. Let's stop now.
Okay. So Chris, do you know what day today is? Today's October 25th.
It is the Feast of St. Crispin.
This is the Feast of St. Crispin, and you know then what happened on the Feast of St. Crispin?
We beat the piss out of the Frenchies.
The Battle of Agincourt.
Yes.
505, I think, years ago. 505 years ago.
We few, we happy few.
Well, let's do the whole thing. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day will gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England, now abed, shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whiles any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day. And believe it or not,
Lawrence.
Believe it or not, we didn't rehearse this. No one's ever going to believe it.
No, I know. It's amazing.
Chris, what do we have coming up next week?
Next week, I'm really, really excited. We have The Mastermind of Dunkirk and D-Day, a new biography of Admiral Bertram Ramsay, who is somebody I have always felt that Americans should know an awful lot more about. And so we will find an awful lot more about him next week.
So some Americans will know an awful lot more about him, and some non-Americans as well.
Well, that's true.
Well, another fun hour. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody.
Thank you. Be safe, everyone. See you next week.
you.